ironic really that this is a video about beginner mistakes and I forget rule number 1. Never work with animals. Beginner mistake number 2, remembering to switch your lights on before you start filming. Beginner mistakes is actually a topic that I've been asked by several people over the years to do a video about. Now, there's already a lot of these types of videos around YouTube, but generally the kind of mistakes that they're covering are things like not using the most optimal settings when you're taking a picture, or not composing your image in the most ideal way, or when you're editing, relying solely on global edits rather than targeting specific areas with some local edits, or just generally over-editing your image in such a way that it looks too over-processed. And they are obviously all valid points, but they're part of the natural learning curve when it comes to photography. Whereas I think the single biggest mistake I've seen beginners make is having the wrong mentality towards photography. Specifically, completely overestimating how much of an impact the quality of your camera has on the quality of your finished image. I'm in several different photography groups at social media. One in particular is quite a big group, and in that group I am seeing an alarming number of people now joining saying, "Hi, I'm brand new to photography, still learning all the ropes, don't really know what I'm doing. I've bought an A7 III or an A7 R3 and I could do with a bit of help." And yeah, my first thought is probably the same as you. Brand new to photography, spending £2,000 or £3,000 on a camera body. Now, if people want to go and spend that much money on their first camera, that is their choice. But not only do I think it's a waste of money, I actually think it's detrimental to them learning photography. Now, I know arguably some of the people saying that they're new to photography might not mean that they're actually brand new to photography. Maybe they've been a hobbyist and an amateur photographer for several years and they're shifting into wanting to do professional, and maybe that's what they're referring to. But I have seen many people in that group posting frankly basic questions. People who are shooting in automatic mode want to know how to get into other modes of the camera. People asking what's the best settings to use for photos, like there ever is one. Even someone the other day had posted several sample shots where they've taken photos pointing at bright light sources and asking what are these weird coloured smudges all across the frame. Obviously lens flare, but they're so new to photography that they've never witnessed lens flare before, never understood what it was, and yet they've bought a £3,000 camera. And where this is going to potentially be detrimental to these people and hinder them is they're starting out in photography. They're trying to learn things. Perfectly understandable, perfectly acceptable. But they've clearly gone in with the mindset of, I want to take good pictures, so I need a really expensive camera. Had they done any real research into starting out in photography, they would have seen any number of people tell them you don't need an expensive camera to start out with. But yet they've managed to land on a really high-end camera, which means they're not looking at what's the best camera to start photography, they're looking for what's the best camera. And they've landed on reviews of several £1,000s worth of full-frame gear. And if they've been watching those reviews, they will have seen reviewers say this camera has really good high ISO performance. So how great it is at being able to shoot at high ISOs and keep cleaner images. Or people talking about how fantastic the dynamic range is, so they can pull the shadows right up and retain all the detail in your image. And while it's great that higher end cameras have those abilities, just because your camera can do them doesn't mean you always need to use them. Except if you're new to photography, you won't know that. You'll just think, wow, really good noise performance and great dynamic range. They're great features to have, so I'm going to make sure I utilize them. And that's where people start to fall into the mentality of, I don't need to worry about the settings. I just get there or thereabouts and I'll be able to fix them in post later. So they end up shooting at higher ISOs than they ever need to bother with. Or they'll be thinking, I need to use the dynamic range, and every picture is going to be crushed highlights and ramped up shadows just because they can. And most of the time, that's never the case. You're a beginner level photographer, start out with some beginner level gear. When the gear is then kind of holding you back, move up with it. Don't just think higher end gear is going to produce better results, because it's not. Because the harsh truth is, if you're a beginner in photography, much like a beginner in anything, you are not going to be anywhere near as good as you can be when you're first starting out, because you're still learning. You'll learn quicker when you're forced to learn quicker because the gear's holding you back and you want to be able to get better results. If you're relying on the gear thinking it's going to give you better results, then it's not only going to potentially give you worse results because you're constantly just thinking, half-arse it and fix it in post, but it's going to take you longer to learn because you're going to spend all this time thinking you can rely on the gear until you then realize you can't. You're then going to basically have to backpedal to the start before you then start getting out of that mentality and learning that actually there's a lot more to what makes a good photo than the quality of your camera. If you factor in everything as to what makes photos look good, the quality of the camera itself is very, very low down the list. And there's plenty of examples in videos to demonstrate this. Situations where a professional and an amateur photographer have gone out shooting together in the same locations. The professional using entry-level camera gear, and the amateur's been given the most expensive high-end gear that you can imagine. And the results that the professional produces always look better than the amateurs. Because while the amateur might have a technically sharper image and a higher resolution image, the framing and the lighting and the storytelling behind it is nowhere to be seen because they've not had the time to learn it. And this is a problem, not just a mistake made by beginner photographers, but is generally a problem in public perception that also harms photographers. Because I don't know about you, but I have had far too many occasions where people have seen photos of mine that they like the look of and then assumed that the photos must look really good because of the camera that I was using. Or sometimes they don't even see the images that I take. Like, they just see me walking around with a fairly professional looking camera and automatically assume that the pictures are going to look fantastic because of it. I have even had several times before where people have been standing next to me looking at exactly the same scene as I have, but I take a different picture than they do. They see it on the back of my camera and they go, oh wow, that's a very nice picture. And I say, thank you very much. And they say, it's unsurprising with a camera like that, to which I've been this close to inserting that camera somewhere about their person that they would not be too happy about. And honestly, it's a silly notion. If you apply that same logic to any other scenario, it sounds ridiculous. Like, have you ever had a really nice meal in a restaurant and thought, wow, the chef back there must have a really flashy oven? Or have you ever seen a painting or a drawing by an artist and assumed that it looks that good because the brushes or the pencils are really expensive? No. That is not to say that having better quality tools isn't going to make your life easier, but it's not automatically going to make you better. I know someone who is a professional artist that does a lot of drawings, and they themselves have said that they use a specific high-end grade paper and they have a particular brand of high-end pencils that they use because they find them easier to work with. But you could give them a piece of cheap printer paper and a kid's pack of pencils and they would still be able to draw better pictures than the majority of people can. I have a friend who's a professional chef and they've been round to this house before and cooked a meal in our kitchen using the same kitchen utensils and the same pots and pans that I use for all our meals, except their food tastes substantially better than anything I've ever made. Not because of the quality of the gear that they're using, but simply the ability that they have to be able to cook. Namely, they have the ability and I don't. And the fact is, photography is like every other skill-based profession out there. You can't fast track and cheat your way to better results. It's like if I wanted to become a racing driver. I can't just decide I'm going to become a racing driver, I'm going to buy myself a really fast, expensive racing car, and suddenly I'm going to be a world champion. Sure, I could buy a flashy, expensive race car, and I'd probably be able to go around a track a little bit faster than I could in a normal everyday road car. But I would never be maximizing the potential of either. But if you were to take a seasoned racing driver and put them in that road car versus me in the race car, the race driver would still win, because even though they've got inferior gear, they know how to get the most out of it. So actually, I would be better off not buying the really expensive car and wasting my money on it. I'd be better off learning how to make the most of what I've already got. Now, there'll probably be some people who've got the notion that buying expensive gear from the start is going to save you money in the long run, because rather than buying entry-level gear and then learning with that for a few years and then deciding to sell it at a devalued price to then have to buy all the higher-end gear, they've just got the higher-end gear to start with. Except fundamentally, there's two problems there. The first, most obvious one is if someone is that gear-headed that they've delved straight into several grand's worth of camera body as their first camera, then in a few years' time, when they've actually started to make the use out of the potential of that camera, there's going to be newer and more superior models on the market that they're going to want to own anyway. So they will probably end up selling the gear that they bought with in the first place to then buy the newer gear. And that old gear will have devalued, except it will have devalued a hell of a lot more than budget level. You could buy a £300 camera now and sell it in 3 years' time for probably half what you paid for it. You've lost 150 quid. You buy a £3 camera now, in 3 or 4 years' time, that'll probably be worth £1,000. The other problem is everyone's needs from gear are different. There's no one camera and lens combination that is suitable for every single photographer. It all depends on what you're trying to shoot, what you like shooting, and the type and style of photography that you're doing. But you don't know what any of that is going to be for you when you're first starting out. You're just learning how to take photos. So you could sink several grand into a really high-end camera and then several years down the line find that actually all the stuff you're shooting never actually needed a high-end camera to begin with. If you're serious about learning photography, a better investment would be, rather than spend £3,000 on a high-end camera body and then have to spend another several grand on expensive lenses to go with it, would be spend a tenth or even less than that on a low-end camera body. Get yourself some accessories like filters or lights or reflectors, something that's going to give you far more flexibility with how you control the light in your images than any high-end camera will ever let you do. You could then use some of that extra money to do photography lessons, either proper full online courses that will teach you all the basics, or maybe even one-to-one tutoring with a photographer. And then with that several grand that you've saved, you can take that gear and all the knowledge that you've just acquired on how to use it and go to exotic locations and go and take some wonderful pictures. But that's it for this video, guys. As always, if you have any questions or queries, comment box is down below. While you're down there, if you enjoyed this video or you found it helpful, then please consider hitting the like and subscribe button, and then hopefully we'll see you in the next video.